Dr. Krick, Jahrgang
Dr. Krick,
1938.
you were born in 1938. What was invented that year? Wikipedia reports Otto Hahn discovering nuclear fission of uranium, Chester Carlson inventing photocopiers, and Eckelberry DuPont nylon. Which of these three, invented in the year of your birth, do you think benefits humankind most?
I'm not sure if benefit's the right word. Probably nuclear fission.
Nuclear fission.
Since nuclear fission has averted wars and put an albeit terrible end to one. Typically, for an engineer, I'm also sure that we can't solve global energy problems without nuclear power. Depleting all our fossil fuels is totally absurd. Just one example. China accounts for 50% of global coal consumption and is planning 360 coal-fired power plants. This equals incredibly high CO2 emissions.
So which of the three would you have preferred to have invented yourself?
My favorite invention would have been nylon, but...
Because of the stockings.
I think legs are more important than stockings. It's because this invention was a global sensation. But on a much smaller scale, we should be happy that we're keeping hundreds and thousands of renal failure patients alive, and we're giving them quality of life.
You lived in quite a few places before you were even 10 or 15 years old. Let's see, Saxony, Bohemia, Mecklenburg, West Pomerania, Saxony-Anhalt, Eastern Westphalia. How did that come about in Gerd Krick's early life?
At an early age, due to the war. As a child, I was acutely aware of it. Saw lots of dead people and often went hungry. I was 7 at the end. In early 1945, village women were planting potatoes. My mom and I were present when Russian low-flying aircraft mowed them down. Or I was in Czechoslovakia in an internment camp. Below us was a POW camp with soldiers screaming all night, suffering torture. The next morning they were hanged while we boys looked on.
What did that do to you?
It gave me a hard shell. I'm no longer so emotional about life.
But could you keep a soft side nevertheless?
Yes, of course. I do have emotions.
What took you to Prague as a child?
We were quite simply rounded up and deported to Czechoslovakia.
And what happened there?
An internment camp with my mother. My father was away at war. My mom and other women had to work in a Czech pressing factory where my mom's thumb was crushed. We returned and moved to Güstrow in Mecklenburg, West Pomerania. I went to school for the first time when I was 10.
So Czech was your first language?
Yes, Czech.
Anything you can still say?
I'm going to punch you in the face. I said that especially often during my childhood. That stuck in my head.
Have you ever felt truly at home anywhere?
Yes, now in Styria, Austria.
Not until now.
Yes. I now know that I'll spend the rest of my days there. It'll be my last home. I've now lived there for almost 13 years. For the first time, it's felt like home. Never had that before.
No roots anyplace else?
No. Perhaps in Munich, where I spent 18 years, but it didn't feel like home.
What does being an Austrian mean to you today?
My grandparents were Austrians, and my goal was always, actually...
To become an Austrian?
Yes, that's right. If you live in a country, then I think it's a good idea to take up citizenship, if you have a home there.
Any pleasant associations with these places early on in your life?
Well, Munich, of course, where I was at college, got my PhD, and enjoyed skiing.
Mecklenburg, West Pomerania?
Really terrible. We suffered awful hunger there. As a boy, I jumped with others from bridges onto moving freight trains carrying coal. Back then, trains were slow. We stole briquettes and swapped them for food. After 1949, I was suffering from malnutrition and was put in a children's home.
It gave you a hard shell. What else? A good judge of character, too?
Yes, I learned that then, too. To spot people you can trust and those you need to avoid.
And has this instinct usually served you well in later life, too?
I think one of my strong points is my good judgment of character and ability to find strong people who've worked well in the company.
How did young Gerd learn to take responsibility or take on a leadership role even? Or not merely tolerate situations, but say, I'm the one in charge here?
I'd like to put it a different way. I've learned to be assertive. If you do that, you're automatically in a leadership role. In my opinion, it's vital to have and stand by opinions and not be immediately deterred just because nobody else shares them. This trait, of course, results from the chaos of war, my time at college and in the military, all of which inevitably turned me into a leader.
Were you a born leader in your childhood and youth? Were you the leader of a coal-stealing gang?
Yes, I was. That's true.
Did you also build teams?
I'm not a fan of teams.
Really?
A team doesn't make decisions. It just deliberates and always looks for someone to take the helm. I look for people seeking responsibility. So a team's a contradiction in terms.
You must have had plenty of opposition, people who thought they knew better, like management consultants.
I've never had management consultants in the firm. Not in my time.
To them, the team is everything. The team's sacred.
You need sparring partners. I'm not interested in people who just share my opinions. You need people around you with different opinions, who you can debate with and who in the end are also responsible for making their own decisions. Or, to put it in a nutshell, oppose yours. That was the firm's principle.
So you allowed people to have different opinions to yours?
Yes, of course. That's the point of it all. I said no in 5% of cases where I was totally sure managers were wrong. But 95% of the time, they were allowed to follow their convictions because they were in charge.
You didn't go to school until you were 10. What's your first conscious recollection of schooling?
I'll have to approach this from a slightly different angle. I didn't go to school until I was 10, and then I was put in 3rd grade. I couldn't really speak proper German. And after 4th grade, my parents thought I should leave elementary school and go to junior high. I was removed, or rather thrown out, after 2 months for being too stupid and incapable. That was my first brush with education. I had to go back to elementary school until 8th grade, then went on to senior high and got my diploma after 6 years instead of the customary 9.
At first you were judged a difficult student. Why?
Because I have opinions, which the school didn't allow.
So you ventured to contradict the teachers.
Yes, I asserted a different opinion.
What were the direct results? Did they wrap your knuckles?
Yes, my hand was wrapped. But the teacher was unfortunate because there were ink pots on the desk and I threw one. And I was left alone from then on.
And you weren't expelled?
No.
Interesting.
But remember, wrapping children's knuckles was also prohibited.
Was there any formative experience in your life that urged you to take a particular step?
My goal was always to be independent from others, because I repeatedly sensed that in my childhood. Education equals independence, and I tried to accomplish that.
You enlisted in the German army, voluntarily. Were you seeking leadership or a leadership position?
I was educated, had qualifications, and wouldn't have been conscripted even. I thought I'd join the army because I was convinced freedom needed fighting for. It was the Cold War era, and I'd witnessed the results of communism and repression. Standing up for freedom appeared a must. This conviction made me join the army, where I experienced camaraderie for the first time in my life. It was a defining influence.
So it taught you a lot about life, a type of early management seminar.
We marched nightly, twice a week, not just once, from 5 p.m. to 6 a.m. We carried dinghies till blood seeped out of the boots from the person in front. But he carried on, regardless. You rarely experience that sort of tough personal attitude today.
And did the war experienced by you and an entire people play any role? Did people feel they never wanted another war? Or during the Cold War, did people fear history would repeat itself?
Nobody thought about the war. I didn't anyway, and don't think anyone else did either. We wanted to defend freedom and combat repression. War didn't figure into it. It was more of a feeling. Nobody wanted to go to war, but to prevent becoming dependent due to a war.
Then you qualified for a college education and picked mechanical engineering in Munich. Or did mechanical engineering pick you?
I had two options. One was medicine, the other mechanical engineering. I like nuts and bolts, so chose that.
Your doctoral thesis was entitled The Interaction Between Rigid Wheels, Tires, and Soft Surfaces. What did you find out?
That's hard to say. I discovered that different surfaces require different tires. But my doctoral thesis isn't really that important. I was working on a far more important project simultaneously: how four-wheel drives handled soft surfaces. That's been printed and mentioned in many publications. It was a simultaneous project. The doctoral thesis was on the small side.
So as a scientist, your biggest missed opportunity was to invent the lunar vehicle.
That was a long way off. That was in St. Petersburg, where they were wondering what tires to use for the lunar vehicle. They were debating whether to choose spiral tires made of steel bands or rubber ones. And my professor and I participated in the discussion.
At NASA.
That was NASA. In St. Petersburg, there was a trough in the ground for performing trials on the tires for the lunar vehicle.
Lending tires a symbolic, metaphoric meaning. They move forward, never stand still.
Your interpretation.
Power biking, motorcycling, heli skiing, windsurfing. Your life seems defined by a passion for speed.
You could conclude that, but it isn't the case. It's more a feeling for motion and perfecting this motion that's vital for these sports. Let's take windsurfing. That's not fast. Windsurfing gives you this feeling of motion and the ability to control your body. That's pretty limited on motorbikes, by the way. But it's a feeling for motion. I never took part in any motorbike races where you relish in the feeling of speed. I never did that. Or riding racing bikes.
And a certain desire to take risks?
Then I'd have participated in motorbike races, but I didn't.
But you did have a serious motorbike accident a few years ago. What happened?
I had a much worse car accident as a passenger. I broke my back. It could have really knocked me back.
When was that?
1964, when I was 26.
So from then on you rode a motorcycle?
Not back then, but I started a few years later and also rode a racing bike. So much has happened to me. I'm not easily put off by such minor setbacks. I still enjoy motorbiking today because I can't accept feeling afraid. Afraid that something might happen. So not doing it. If you're afraid, you might as well stay in bed. Then you'd be dead in 2 years.
The sports you do aren't team-driven. Is that because you're only competing against yourself?
Yes, you could put it that way. I've never really thought about it. But it probably plays a role. They're mainly sports you do alone. That's true.
But let's return to your college days, the era of student revolts and flower power. It's hard to imagine you against a 60s or 70s backdrop.
You're absolutely correct. I spent my time studying and working. People thought I was a bit of a screwball.
Were you politically active in any way?
No, simply because it would have distracted me from my work.
Do mechanical engineers win Nobel Prizes? I'm not sure.
I don't think we've ever had one.
That's pretty unfair, actually.
That is unfair, it's true. I can't remember anyone, anyway.
So nobody had the chance to win the Nobel Prize for inventing the polysulfon filter?
Someone should have gotten a Nobel Prize for using fiber or cellophane for the first time to remove toxins from a renal failure patient. That was Willem Kolff in 1943, I think. He would have really deserved a Nobel Prize. His name was put forward, but he didn't win one.
Victory and defeat. Do those categories play an important role in your life?
I wouldn't distinguish between victory and defeat. I'd say defeat plays a role. It's not a question of victory. It's not victory that's important per se, but avoiding a defeat.
Were there defeats you considered heavy blows?
Yes, when I had to leave junior high.
Is there anything typically German about dealing with defeat of a personal nature too?
Defeat means you're desperately seeking a culprit and don't realize it's you. And that's the hardest. Recognizing you're at fault is very, very difficult. And it's easier to look for a scapegoat first.
Over the past 30 or 40 years, has anything changed in business regarding the so-called blame culture?
I believe it has.
Has it improved?
Today's key goal is to avoid risks, or in other words, failure. And if you avoid it, you'll keep your job forever because you can't make any mistakes. But that doesn't grow a business. You don't create value by avoiding risks. And if you avoid risks, failure doesn't occur. So you're doing your job and everything's going great. Unfortunately, growth ceases and there's no increase in value. I'm someone who judges people by their ability to create value. I object to people who merely consume value. And I believe that's an aspect that you should be driven by. Does what I do create value? That can be very different.
But even garbage collectors create value.
Of course, a college education isn't required. It's a question of value creation. Some people are consumers of value from the start, but some people clearly only become them over time. Toughness is required to be a value creator instead of a consumer. Consuming value is far easier because you can live at the expense of others.
I hear you've been taking the same brown leather attaché case to work for 60 years. Is that true?
I don't know if it's 60 or 58 years, but that's right, yes.
Have you got it with you?
Yes, I have.
Can I see it?
Yes, I can show it to you. Here you are. It's already a bit shabby, and I've mended it with screws, just like engineers do, with the screw and washer underneath.
Can I take a look inside, or is that too personal?
Go ahead. There are no secrets in there. Contains a newspaper and a few papers.
What? No laptop? No smartphone?
No smartphone, no laptop, nothing.
As Supervisory Board Chairman, how do you monitor a firm listed twice on the DAX without these crazy gadgets that all the kids have and give us inferiority complexes about? How is that possible?
By having people on the board who run the business. And anyone wanting to reach me can always send me a fax. Basically, I've got everything I need if people send me a fax, because that creates work. Each time, people will wonder if it's really worth writing and sending me a fax.
In other words, not CCing you.
Exactly. Otherwise, they write mails and 25 people get all the same information. If you want something from me, send a fax. Then I'll call and discuss the issue at hand.
Any idea what was in the famed Krick leather attaché case when you joined Fresenius in 1975?
Actually, the contents of the leather case never vary. It probably contained a bread and butter sandwich for lunch, as I've never gone to the canteen. I only ever eat butter sandwich for lunch because I don't want to waste any time. I'd be too tired afterwards, and I can still read at the same time. So I definitely had a sandwich and usually a newspaper with me. And I don't take papers to or from work.
What newspaper was it?
The Frankfurter Allgemeine, and back then the Süddeutsche because I'd come from Munich.
Do you take work home with you each evening?
No. I might work in the office until 10 p.m. or perhaps even 1 a.m. I don't care. But nothing goes home with me.
Ich habe eine ganz strikte Trennung zwischen Arbeit und, sage ich jetzt mal,
I'd like to draw a line between work and, let's say, exercise, sport, and my private life.
In 1951, a man by the name of Hans Kröner walked into the Hirsch Pharmacy in Frankfurt. The rest is Fresenius history, most of which is your own. Believe in coincidences?
No, not at all. Coincidences occur every day. Would you like an example?
Yes.
I lived on Fresenius Street in Munich. That's quite a coincidence. And I then worked for Fresenius.
That's destiny.
I worked at Stiefenhofer, and Mr. Stiefenhofer was chairman of the company's supervisory board. I'd never had any dealings with either of them, Fresenius or Dr. Stiefenhofer.
So Hans Kröner was driven by some God-given urge to seek out Hirsch Pharmacy?
He was walking along Tile Street, needed some medication, went into Hirsch Pharmacy and got talking to Mrs. Kröner, just like you do in life.
She was the pharmacist.
Elsa Kröner was convinced that he was a good manager, and Hans Kröner became her manager. First, he kept his job in Munich until he decided to move to Bad Homburg and go full-time. And in the company's difficult early years, he turned a pharmacy into a company.
Any coincidences that were key turning points in your career?
Is it a coincidence that I got to know Hans Kröner? It's quite simple. I was at a trade show for a company and went to various stands. Somebody knew Fresenius, who we were supplying with autoclaves for sterilizing ampules. Someone told me to go there if I wanted to get to know Mr. Kröner. So I went and talked to him and the people at the stand. He explained that he produced astronauts' food with powder that you had to mix with water. That's how I got to know Hans Kröner. He was so taken with me that he called and asked me to come for an interview. So I went to Bad Homburg for an interview with him, his wife, and someone else. 6 months later, he came to Munich to visit me. He told me stories about his life and that he was very attached to his mom. It was quite emotional, and then I agreed. That was the start. Do you call that a coincidence? No.
What was your vision for Fresenius back in 1975 as head of research, development, production, and technology? 4 areas.
To produce the best products possible, and to have the best products, period. We already had dialysis products, but merely sold them. At the time, I was starting not to develop, but to commission development of a completely new dialysis machine. We wanted to have dialysis machines that we made ourselves. It was clear that dealers wouldn't survive in the long run in that segment. If they sell a lot, their agency's taken away. If they sell nothing, they also go empty-handed. So the only option was to make something ourselves. The first thing we did was to develop cuprophane dialysis machines from fibers we bought from Inca Glanzstoff and packaged, or put in a casing. Actual dialysis is carried out in the membrane, not the packaging. Then we realized we had to make our own dialysis fiber. Otherwise, we'd have no chance in the segment. Everyone else was also buying from Inca. My skill is not the invention itself. My skill lies in judging whether people and certain technologies are good. It's a feeling for what's feasible. I looked around for other options and found the Berghof Institute in Stuttgart. It belonged to the Bosch Foundation.
so Nudeln gemacht, also wie Spaghetti.
On a small scale, basically with a pail and a simple nozzle, they produced spaghetti-like noodles, big things made of polysulfon for a physician in Stuttgart.
Das Know-how kaufen, die Lizenz.
I offered to buy the expertise from them in the form of a license. After initial setbacks, they sold it to me for 150,000 marks.
A great deal.
Absolutely.
Und dann habe ich eine Düse mitgenommen, so einen Eisenklotz.
Then I took a nozzle with me, really a chunk of iron, a pail, and a formula on how to blend it.
Mit der Düse bin ich zu einem
And armed with the pail and nozzle, I went to one of our highly skilled managers and said, "We can use this to spin polysulfon. Have a go."
Mach was. Den Namen kann ich ruhig nennen.
That was a Mr. Heilmann.
Der hat dann angefangen, wirklich dieses Know-how
He used this expertise to develop equipment for spinning fibers.
machen, wo dann Faser gesponnen wurden, die etwas dicker waren am Anfang, als
At the beginning, slightly thicker than a hair, with a hole in the middle.
gebohrt hat und wo dann
Eventually, he asked me for a machine that was so big that I said, "Heilmann, if that doesn't work, how are we going to smuggle it out of the firm?"
Did controllers exist then?
das gehabt hätten, dann würde
If we'd had one, the project wouldn't have come about, that's for sure.
How did you do it?
Einzelteile so gekauft, dass sie immer unter meinem
I bought the parts, so they were just about within the budget I got for it.
unter das Budget waren. Also ich habe die
I divided up the big machine into 4.
So the number crunchers didn't know the vast scale.
haben sie erst danach
But they only found that out later.
Auch das hat sich geändert.
That's also changed over the past few decades. Controlling is now an omnipotent force. Nobody dares do anything.
Und keiner traut sich mehr was.
Das ist genau das, was ich sage.
That's what I'm saying.
Die Wachstumsgeschwindigkeit in Deutschland wird
In Germany, the pace of growth will slow enormously because it's all about risk and not opportunity.
in den Firmen an der Spitze immer nur noch Risikomanager. Und die den Aktionären gegenüber
At the top, companies only seem to have risk managers that always have to prove to stockholders, the workforce, and the unions that they haven't run any risks. Because running risks possibly means layoffs.
Only banks don't have risk preventers, or didn't have in the past.
die Zeit heute denkt in Quartalen.
Today we think in quarters,
Von der Ingenieurseite kommt
but an engineer automatically takes a long-term view.
viele dieser technischen Probleme brauchen sie
Lots of these technical problems take 5 years or more to solve,
viele Betriebswirtschaftler.
which is why a lot of business administrators feature at the top.
Was sagen über technische Entwicklungen in
Because figures can be posted quarterly, and technical developments take 3 years.
eine solche
So it's also hard for engineers to reach the top because they need 3 to 5 years to achieve their goals. A superior product development takes 3 to 5 years, no matter what you do.
aber die Zahlen,
But it only takes an afternoon to add up figures.
Explain Krick's shower theory.
wenn der Außendienstmitarbeiter morgens aufsteht,
Sales reps should set themselves a target under the shower each morning.
das Krankenhaus XY
Perhaps Hospital XY will buy 50,000 dialysis filters from me today. 10 targets means they can become divisional directors.
Bereichsleiter werden,
And once they've achieved 100 targets, they can become board members.
Wie darf man sich denn die
Tell us something about how you conquered America as the top Fresenius sales rep.
Wie ging das denn los?
Where did it all start?
Rübergeschickt und gesagt,
I'm sure you didn't fax them to talk about an interesting machine and ask them to fax orders back.
ganz weit weg ist es von der Wahrheit ja gar nicht. Zu mir nach damals Deutschland sind 2 Amerikaner gekommen.
That's not too far from the truth, actually. At that time, 2 Americans approached me in Germany. One of them was Ben Lips.
Mitarbeiter von ihm hatte eine
The two had started a business in a garage in the US
Umsatz.
with sales of $3 million.
Die wollten gern die Vertriebsrechte für das Dialysegerät.
They wanted the sales rights to the dialysis machines we'd developed.
Dann habe ich mit denen diskutiert und habe gesagt, das ist ja Blödsinn, ich gebe euch nicht die
I said no way,
Vertriebsrechte, ich kaufe eure.
but that I would buy their company
Und wir machen
and
das
do it with them.
Und damit haben wir
And so we bought the company for $1 million.
und dabei war ein Dr. Lips.
I told Dr. Lips that we had a better dialysis system with controlled ultrafiltration and a high-flux dialyser
Und ein High-Flux-Dialysat.
that was extremely permeable, that couldn't be operated with normal machines.
Da braucht
A machine was required, like the one we had.
und dann hat er gesagt,
Dr. Lips believed it would be impossible to sell in the US, and that we'd have to manufacture a standard, pressure-controlled dialysis machine. He wanted us to make 150, and maybe 2 of our new machines to start off. I told Bin I had another suggestion. We wanted to come over and sell our machine with controlled ultrafiltration to American physicians. So I flew back with him to one of the major dialysis providers, the Antons, who had 25 machines. They were 2 Jewish brothers who had lost their folks in the Holocaust. And I was a German heading there.
A great start.
Yes, and we sold them 25 dialysis machines.
Well done.
From that moment on, I visited other dialysis units with Bin Lips, and we sold 150 dialysis machines in the first year. That's how our US business started, from $3 million to today's figures.
So years later, Fresenius CEO Dr. Gerd Krick thought, we're not going to buy a company in the US for $1 million, but one for $3.3 billion. What a huge leap, in terms of time, too. What was your vision back then? Considering the situation at the time, you have to say, how crazy was that?
That's what others thought. My vision was a different one. Back then, there were only about 30 companies making dialysis machines. Today, there are only 2, and we're the biggest by far. We've only achieved that because our products are vastly superior. Nobody can better our dialysis products. That's a fact. There might be some that are just as good, but definitely no better ones. In other words, technology has got us where we are today. And if there are better products, then these sell too. Sales reps have to be pretty stupid not to sell a better product. And at some point, you sell better products to the whole dialysis sector and wonder where further growth is to come from. And the obvious solution is to become a service provider, just like we're a hospital service provider today.
Where margins are better too.
Yes, nowadays we manage hospitals too. We bought the first company in 1992. My vision was already to enter the hospital sector. It was clear that we should perform dialysis treatments as well. We already had small dialysis units that belonged to us in Europe. Then we had this fantastic opportunity in the US when the Grace Group wanted to sell its dialysis treatment division. Then we decided we'd buy. So we were competing with Baxter. It's crazy, but true. Gerd Krick and Bin Lips stood in front of shareholders in a movie theater and explained what great guys we were and what great products we had.
Did the banks and supervisory board members trust you?
The supervisory board members didn't have much choice. Either you accept growth or you don't.
But back then, the Handelsblatt wrote the headline, "Herring eats shark." How did the small fry manage to swallow the big fish?
By placing our full trust in the American management team there. There's no other way. Of course, I influenced which of the US managers did what. 3 people were after one job. Responsibilities need outlining clearly, but it had to be Americans and not Germans.
Were there any German bankers nervous about this deal?
Yes. They still thought if it misfired, they could sell the dialysis division. Earlier, it had been suggested to Hans Kröner that the dialysis division could be sold.
Did you wonder what you'd do if it went wrong?
No. If you're convinced, then you'll do it. But you can't spend every day thinking about what you'll do if it goes wrong. You have to resolve to do it, stand by your decision, and fight for it. You can't keep worrying about your actions in the event of failure. You know that if it backfires, you're out of a job, and that's that.
When did your visionary mindset focus on the hospital as a potential acquisition?
In 1992, I bought a hospital company called Hospitalia from Siemens. Hospitalia built and operated the technical side of hospitals, for example in Saudi Arabia. Siemens and Philips had lost a lot of money there, so they sold Hospitalia. Cash assets were bigger than the purchasing price, as were the problems. We knew we'd have to place it on a much bigger footing. So we bought Vamed in Vienna too. In Germany, 3 large private hospital operators existed at the time: Asklepios, Rhön, and Helios. All 3 companies were managed by sole entrepreneurs. And as so often happens in life, a sole entrepreneur often decides to pursue other goals. Back then, I negotiated with Mr. Lutz Helmich from Helios.
That was easier than with the Americans. He's old school like you.
Lutz Helmich, a great guy, and we trusted each other. He knew that if the deal succeeded, we'd run his chain acceptably. We didn't have loads of capital at the time, and he wasn't yet prepared to partner up with us in that way. Then I bought the Wittgenstein clinics to learn how to run a hospital. We knew how to build them and look after the technology, how to fit them out and do everything. But we didn't know how to run a hospital with all the healthcare services. So that was the Wittgenstein clinics episode. My successor, Dr. Ulf Mark Schneider, then managed to sign the agreement with Lutz Helmich that I'd sought 5 years previously.
Has buying the Wittgenstein clinics been worthwhile?
It was always a loss maker, because I knew from the start there was no money in it. We spent the money purely to gain experience. We wanted to learn. That's what you have to do sometimes. It's completely different if you only get others to do things. But I knew we couldn't earn any money. We broke even, lost a bit. But we did at least learn to run a hospital. On this basis, it was easier to decide to buy a big chain.
Given controlling, risk management, compliance officers, and the trappings required to manage a company today, how do you make any decisions based on gut feelings? Do gender quotas help?
That's the worst thing you can do. It renders stockholders powerless. This quota doesn't answer for its consequences. The quota stipulates something, and in the end, nobody's responsible for the results. That's the same problem with executive pay. The supervisory board has to hire and recruit executives with a decent salary and set pay levels. And someone else decides how much pay they get? Then I have to say that if someone else decides executive pay levels, then they have to select the people too. And as everyone knows, that can't work. I'm against these type of regulations, because nobody's liable for the consequences.
You once said that Fresenius was virtually unknown to analysts when sales had long been worth billions. Why? Due to understatement, strategy, or a quirk on the part of the founders?
I think Hans Kruner probably played a part initially, but my attitude's the same. Large-scale PR doesn't entail any business benefits or necessarily create added value. It takes time and increases the risk of negative publicity. We need to ask, whose attention in the public arena do we want? Our customers are the patients, and our goal is to convey that they can receive the best healthcare in our hospitals or with our products. We don't need massive PR campaigns for that. The banks quickly learn how to rate a company when they recoup the money that they've invested. We don't need large-scale publicity.
Is Fresenius today still the global corporation with the fewest chauffeurs on the payroll?
I'm sure that's the case. That was my basic principle. You can see if companies are flourishing by how many chauffeurs they have in relation to the executive board.
And that would be
One.
one.
So I've almost always driven myself.
Manager Magazine adopted you into its Business Hall of Fame. I think I'm right in saying it was one of the few tributes you've accepted. Of the three late Hall of Fame legends, Karl Schiller, Ludwig Erhard, or Axel Springer, tell us who you'd pick for a motorbike tour.
Ludwig Erhard, if he'd been able to ride a motorbike. I'd say that he was the one who realized that true added value was created by independent minds and didn't want to see restrictions imposed by others.
When you switched in 2003 from CEO to the Supervisory Board and Dr. Ulf Mark Schneider succeeded you, did you roughly guess how the company would stand today?
Yes. The position we're in today would have been impossible if Dr. Schneider had done a poor job, but he excelled.
Dr. Krick, when you look back, how much do you regret?
Nothing. On the contrary.
And when you look ahead, what gives you the most pleasure?
It might sound strange, but I'm delighted that my successor is so fantastically good. So I'm relaxed. The company's growing, and I'm delighted every day that he's doing such a great job.
You're no longer the Fresenius CEO, but still want to create value. And I hear you're now producing wines in your vineyard in Styria. Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Pinot Blanc. Is that right?
Yes, it's true.
You've spent your life purifying the blood of chronically ill people. Privately, as a winemaker, your passion is to combat what diseases? Mildew, chlorosis, rot and viruses, nematodes, and grapevine diseases. It's a massive area.
Passion is the wrong word here.
You're not scientifically ambitious in this area?
It's hard to think of winemaking as a science. It's an art form. There are a few basic rules. And of course, scientific research is done. But I reject the idea that science produces a good wine. I'd say it's up to the art of the winemaking.
What's the best wine to toast a successful life?
Anyone.
Any wine.
Yes.